this is a follow-up video to the earlier one, getting you started on gridding. So this, in this video, you can see that I have finished creating the grid and I've started to draw. So I have done some of this already, so I'm just going to walk you through what I did. The very first thing that I did was I drew in the edge of this white border. So it can be kind of confusing otherwise to keep in mind where the edge of the paper is. So this represents the edge of the paper, so this outside edge, and then where this white border is. So that's the first thing I did, and I looked to see this little tiny grid here. I'm going to zoom in. And I'm going to make that a little clearer here. So this little tiny square here should be equal to, it's not really a square, but that spot should be equal to this space here. So I started my border, I looked at proportions and estimated how large that was here. And you can't take it for granted that it's going to be the same width all the way around. So as you can see, when you get to the bottom, we've got this tiny little sliver down here of the photo, and then you have the white border is pretty skinny, but in other places, you know, it might be a little bit different, so you have to keep looking to see how wide is that border going to be. All right. The other thing that you need to make sure is that however you had this grid lined up when you were doing it on the white paper, I have to have it lined up the same way on my photo. So the easiest way to figure that out is to see, okay, this is where it says www.printablepaper.net, and so that's going to be oriented the same way on here. All right. Then I'm simply going square by square as I work. So when I look at this first square here, there's basically nothing there. So then I can go down to this little sliver here and see, okay, that's where the very edge of the arm starts. And I can look at, okay, starts here and then ends not quite halfway across. So I get that big angle, and then I can also go back and within that get some of these smaller sort of details. So you can see here, that's the only really main line going on, but I can give it some of the little ups and downs and bumps after I've got the main thing there. So I did first that angle, and then I can start to add in some of those little detail bumps, and then I did these little tiny shapes within that. And I can even see now, okay, I can actually add those with a little bit more accuracy too. So some of them are larger, some of them are smaller, some of them are sort of round, some of them are more flat. And I can estimate that. We also do have some shadows here. So shadows aren't going to necessarily have hard edges, but you can kind of look to see sort of maybe some of the soft edges and put those in really, really lightly. You may find right here next door, I've got a larger, not very dark, but this sort of shadow shape. So when I get to that square, I can put that in as a roughly outlined shape. And it's very, very light. So that little shape there, that shadow, might be represented by this lightly outlined shape there. So I'm going to walk you through a bit more of this as I go here. You can see in some of these areas I kept going up the shoulder. That was where I started. So I went to this next square and I copied that the best I could. So first kind of looking at that overall edge and that angle, then getting in some of those details, including those little sort of holes in the sweater and this edge of this little bump there. Kept going, kept going. This square, 7D, was one of the first really challenging ones. So I actually, once I tried it once and it wasn't quite coming out, so I used a thin permanent Sharpie marker and my ruler to mark off a grid on there. And then I similarly, so you can see that a little bit better when I put it over the white, so I similarly marked off a light grid here in pencil, and that helped me get all of these edges of the shapes. One of the reasons why that was so hard is because it is very dark and you have lots of things overlapping. So notice I also have my photo there, so I can zoom in a little bit on that area and see a little bit better how these shapes are. You don't have to necessarily worry whether you can tell which strand is which. All you really have to do is draw the shapes as you see them in those boxes. In some ways it might be easier to start shading right away. The only problem with that is that before we start to shade, we're going to erase all of these grid lines. So after our outlined portrait is done, we erase the grids and then we start shading. So if I start shading now, I run the risk that it's going to be really hard to erase those grid lines later. So if you do mark in just a very limited amount of shading, that might help you. But you don't want to fully shade because you're just going to have to then erase the grid lines. But it could help to kind of roughly sort of indicate maybe that some of those areas are going to be shaded later. You can see in other areas here. So in the mouth area, that was another square where I wanted to make sure I had everything just right. So I marked it off there so that I can make sure to get the size of the mouth correct there. Otherwise, I might have made that mouth quite a bit bigger. Another really tricky part is what to do with the nose. So it doesn't look perfect yet, but what I'm trying to do is kind of outline some of these shadows. So noses have hard edges sort of toward the bottom and this edge, but then the rest of it is defined by shadow. So I'm just sort of outlining where I think those shadows will be. So this is where having done that nose before might help you, because you know that this shape is going to stick out in front of this other form over here. And you know where to expect some of those hard edges, like down here at the bottom edge of the nostril, and where to expect some of those soft edges. Another place that can be a little bit tricky, so this square, F3, doesn't necessarily have a lot going on, but at the hairline. So hair can be tricky. So it's not a perfect edge. So again, just like any other soft edge, I just tried to put that in kind of lightly. If you want to, you can kind of do a little bit of this feathered line here, and that starts to suggest that hairline, the way the hair grows from the scalp there. But This is not, don't worry about making it perfect. Don't necessarily worry about drawing every little hair within the hair right away. If I can see sort of this edge here of a shape within the hair, that I might want to draw. But what I'm not going to try to do is every single hair. I might see a few of these kind of hairs or shapes or edges sticking out from everything else. But that's it. That would be the most detail that I would give this. So most of this, as you can see, is just outlined. On my black and white copy, I don't even see any detail here, so I started out just looking at that. So this part of my drawing is just blank. If I'm also looking at this, the color version, I might then see a little bit more of this edge within there. Other places to really watch out for, the eyes. So this is another place where you need to really use the proportions on the grid. So this is a place to even measure out what is the true center of this. And that's going to help me see if I do that here and on here, and I do that in this next block down as well, I'm going to be able to see a lot better to copy this. So creating that grid here and on here, and then also using my ruler to break that up here. That helps me see, oh wow, this eye only goes a little tiny bit into this quarter, this bottom quarter of the grid. You know, it goes, you know, the opening maybe goes maybe only a quarter up, and then the eyelid goes maybe almost halfway up. And then below here, again, this eye opening is just the smallest little sliver of that, and then you have a little bit of that outline of the lower lid. Notice too, I've got like maybe these little like shadows here indicating kind of like that lower eyelid when I'm smiling. So if I make those heavy lines, they look weird, but using really, really light lines to indicate the shadows that I see can make that look accurate. All right, those are my tips. I'm going to go ahead and just demonstrate gridding this other side of the mouth and this portion over here. So notice, I'm drawing in lightly that pencil grid to help me see.